The day was drizzling lightly, the kind of rain that didn't feel like it would stop anytime soon. Inside the small diner, the sound of sizzling pancakes and brewing coffee filled the air, while the familiar hum of conversations blended with the clink of dishes. Grace had been working the morning shift for the past 3 years. It was her routine, the rhythm of her life. She knew the regulars by name, knew their orders before they even sat down. But this morning felt different. The bell above the door jingled, and a shiver of uncertainty ran down her spine. She glanced toward the door, expecting to see one of the usual faces, but instead, a boy stood there. He was young, no older than 15, maybe 16, wearing ragged clothes that clung to his thin frame. His hair was unkempt, and his eyes held an emptiness that struck Grace to the core. She had seen plenty of homeless people come in for a cup of coffee or something warm, but this boy, he was different. He didn't just look lost. He looked like he had nowhere to go, nowhere to be. For a moment, Grace hesitated. She had worked in this diner long enough to know that the world was full of people who'd ask for help, but there was always a story behind the eyes of those who truly needed it. This boy's eyes told a story of pain, of hardship, and of something else, something Grace couldn't place. Her heart twisted. She couldn't just let him stand there in the cold, not like this. It was against everything she believed in to ignore someone in need. "Can I help you?" Grace asked, her voice soft, her hand still gripping the cloth she was wiping down the counter with. The boy slowly lifted his gaze, and for the first time, their eyes met. His eyes flickered with surprise, as though he hadn't expected someone to speak to him. I'm hungry," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the clattering plates. Grace nodded, her mind already making decisions faster than her body could follow. "Sit down. I'll get you something warm." The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding and slinking toward an empty booth in the far corner of the diner. Grace watched him, her heart heavy. She felt an overwhelming urge to help him, but something about the way he moved, the way he kept his head low, his shoulders hunched, made her feel uneasy. He wasn't just hungry. There was something more. She went into the kitchen and returned with a steaming bowl of soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. "Here you go," she said as she set the meal in front of him. "It's the best we've got." He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a kind of disbelief, as if he hadn't had a warm meal in days. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. Grace gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You're welcome. Take your time." She watched as he began to eat, but his gaze never left his plate. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Grace found herself wondering about him, what had brought him here, what had caused the emptiness in his eyes. But she didn't ask. She knew better than to pry. But as she wiped down the counter and watched him eat, a strange feeling gnawed at her. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the boy. It was the way the diner felt today. The way the rain seemed to drum harder against the windows. The way the bell above the door jingled again. But when Grace looked up, no one was there. It was almost as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The boy finished his meal, pushing the empty plate away from him with a soft sigh. He sat back, staring at the plate as if he didn't know what to do next. Then he looked up at Grace again, his expression more serious now. "Do you believe in fate?" he asked, his voice strangely calm. But there was a weight to it that made Grace pause. She wasn't sure how to answer. She had never given much thought to fate. Life was just something you navigated, dealt with day by day. But there was something in the boy's eyes that made her pause. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice uncertain. "I guess I never really thought about it." The boy nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the plate. "I think fate brought me here," he said quietly, almost to himself. Grace didn't know what to say to that, but before she could respond, the door swung open again. This time, a man entered. He wasn't tall, but there was something imposing about him. His dark sunglasses hid his eyes, but his presence seemed to fill the entire room. He looked around for a moment, scanning the diner, and then his gaze landed on the boy. The boy froze, his body stiffening as the man approached. There was no mistaking the look of fear in his eyes now, the way his hands trembled slightly, gripping the edge of the table. The man stopped in front of the boy's booth, his shadow looming over him. "There you are," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. Grace felt a sudden chill run down her spine. Something was off about this interaction. The way the man spoke, the way the boy reacted, it was like they knew each other, but it didn't feel like a reunion. It felt like something else. The man's lips curled into a small, almost mocking smile. "You thought you could run away, huh?" he said, leaning in closer. Grace stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She had to do something. But what? Her instinct told her to stay out of it, but the boy's terrified eyes wouldn't let her. "What do you want from him?" Grace asked, her voice shaking slightly as she stepped toward the booth. The man turned slowly to face her, his smile never fading. "None of your business, lady. This doesn't concern you." He turned back to the boy. "You're coming with me." Now, Grace's heart raced. She could see the boy's face, pale, stricken with fear. He shook his head slightly, as if trying to plead with the man without saying a word. Something in Grace snapped. She wasn't going to let this happen. Not in her diner. Not on her watch. "No," Grace said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. "He stays here." The man's eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment, she saw a dangerous glint in them. But then he chuckled, a low, menacing sound that sent a shiver through Grace. "You really don't want to do this, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with menace. But before Grace could respond, the boy spoke up, his voice barely audible. "Please leave her out of this." The man's expression shifted for a moment, and Grace thought she saw something like hesitation in his eyes, but it was gone so quickly she wondered if she had imagined it. He straightened, his shoulders squared. "You've made a mistake, boy," the man said. "This won't end well for you." With that, he turned sharply and walked out of the diner. The bell jingled again, but this time it was a sound of finality. Grace stood there, stunned, her heart pounding in her chest. What had just happened? Who was that man? And what did he want with the boy? The boy didn't move for a moment, staring after the man, as if in disbelief. Then slowly he turned to Grace, his eyes filled with something darker now. Fear, yes, but also determination. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you don't know what you've just done." Grace opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but before she could say anything, the boy stood up quickly, his face a mask of urgency. He grabbed his tattered jacket and rushed out the door, disappearing into the rain before Grace could stop him. And just like that, he was gone. The diner felt colder now, emptier. Grace stood frozen in place, her mind racing. What had just happened? What was the boy running from? And what did the man want with him? Grace couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. In the days that followed, the diner felt different. Grace couldn't stop thinking about the boy and the man. She wondered if she'd ever see him again, if she'd ever know what really happened that day. But there was something she couldn't quite shake, a sense of foreboding that hung over her like a storm cloud, just waiting to burst. And deep down, she knew one thing for sure. Her life and the boy's would never be the same. Days passed, and Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The diner, which had always been a haven of warm cups of coffee and casual chatter, now felt like a place under siege, as if it was the last bastion of safety in a world that was slipping into chaos. The rain had never quite stopped, and the steady drumming against the windows seemed to echo the relentless pounding in her mind. Every time the door jingled, she'd tense up, half expecting the boy or that man to walk back in. But they never did, and with each passing day, the sense of dread that had settled in her chest only grew. It was a Tuesday when it all came to a head. The day started like any other. Grace arrived early to open the diner, just before the first rays of sunlight hit the street. The warm lights inside contrasted with the damp gray sky outside, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee was a welcome comfort. As she wiped down the tables, her mind wandered back to that boy, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and if he was safe. It wasn't like her to care so much about someone she'd only met for a few minutes, but the look in his eyes, it haunted her. She'd never seen someone so young carry such a burden. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Grace out of her thoughts. She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw him. The boy was standing in the doorway, drenched from the rain, his clothes sticking to his skin like wet paper. His eyes, which had once been filled with fear and desperation, now looked tired, defeated. He was no longer the boy who had walked into the diner so full of uncertainty. Now he was something else, someone who had seen things no one should have to see. His shoulders were slumped, his gaze lowered, but as soon as he saw Grace, he hesitated. His eyes flickered with something, hope maybe, before he slowly walked toward the counter. Grace didn't know what to say. She wanted to speak, to ask him where he'd been, what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just gestured to the booth he had sat in before. "You're back," she said softly, trying to sound casual, though her heart was pounding in her chest. He nodded, sitting down slowly, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice barely audible. Grace immediately moved toward him, her heart aching at the sight of his despair. "You don't have to explain," she said quickly, trying to offer some comfort. Just sit tight. I'll get you something warm." She went into the kitchen without waiting for a reply, her mind racing. What had happened to him? Why was he back? And what did he mean by, "I didn't know where else to go"? The question gnawed at her as she prepared a fresh plate of food. She couldn't help but feel the shadow of that man, the one who had come into the diner weeks ago, looming over them. What was the boy running from? What had Grace gotten herself tangled in by offering help? The minutes felt like hours as she carried the food to the boy. She placed the plate in front of him, but he didn't immediately pick up the fork. His eyes were distant, staring off into nothingness, lost in a world that Grace couldn't comprehend. For a moment, she thought he might not even eat, that he might not even care. But then, slowly, he picked up the fork and took a bite. He chewed slowly, almost mechanically, as if he wasn't tasting the food at all. Grace watched him, her heart breaking for him, for the boy who had lost so much. She wanted to reach out, to ask him what had happened, but there was something in the way he avoided her gaze, something that told her it wasn't time. He wasn't ready to talk. She had to let him go at his own pace, but she wouldn't stop caring. She couldn't. As she stood there, wiping down the counter, Grace noticed something strange. The diner, which had been almost completely empty when the boy walked in, was now filling up with customers. At first, it seemed normal, just the usual regulars. But there was a tension in the air that wasn't there before. The chatter that had once been pleasant now felt forced, almost uneasy. It was as if everyone knew something they weren't saying, as if the air itself was thick with secrets. Grace tried to ignore it, focusing on the boy instead. She checked on him a few times, offering refills and trying to make small talk, but he never said much. It was clear he was lost in his own world. Finally, as the afternoon wore on and the lunch rush began to quiet down, Grace decided to take a break. She slipped into the back, leaning against the kitchen counter as she tried to collect her thoughts. She had barely closed her eyes when she heard the unmistakable sound of the bell above the door. It jingled, signaling someone's entrance, and Grace's heart sank. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Her body stiffened, her hands trembling as she wiped them on her apron. She stepped back into the main room, her eyes immediately scanning the space. And there he was, the man, the one who had come in weeks ago, the one who had spoken to the boy with that terrifying edge in his voice. He was standing near the door, scanning the room as though he was looking for someone. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. He was here for the boy. She knew it. Her instinct was to warn him, to do something to protect him. But what could she do? The man was a stranger, but his presence felt anything but unfamiliar. It was like a dark cloud that had followed them both, just waiting to descend. The man's gaze settled on the boy, who was still sitting in the booth, now with his head lowered. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she saw the boy's reaction. His body tensed, his eyes flickered toward the man, and then quickly dropped to his plate as if trying to disappear into it. He was terrified. The man didn't move at first. He stood there, his eyes fixed on the boy, but then he began to walk toward him slowly, purposefully. Every step he took seemed to echo in the silence that had descended over the diner. The other customers were pretending not to notice, but Grace could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't just stand there and watch as the boy was dragged back into whatever nightmare he had escaped from. She moved quickly, slipping behind the counter and grabbing the phone. Before she could dial the number for the police, she heard the man speak. His voice was low, just loud enough for Grace to hear, but not for anyone else. "You think you can hide from me?" he said, his voice almost a growl. The boy didn't respond. He didn't even look up. But Grace saw his fists clench, his knuckles white. He was shaking, and for the first time, she realized just how much fear had taken root inside of him. "Get away from him," Grace said, her voice more forceful than she intended. The man stopped mid-step, turning his head to look at her. His eyes were cold, unfeeling, but there was something in them, something that chilled Grace to the bone. It was a look of recognition. "You," the man said, as if he knew her. "You're the one who helped him. You shouldn't have done that." Grace's stomach dropped. "What do you want from him?" The man's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile of warmth. It was a smile of something darker, something more sinister. "I want him to come with me," he said, his voice still low, like a predator stalking its prey. "And I don't care who stands in my way." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but she wasn't about to let him take the boy. Not now. Not after everything she had seen in his eyes. She took a step forward, her hand trembling as it gripped the edge of the counter. She wasn't a hero, she knew that. She was just a waitress, a simple woman with no real power. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. She couldn't just stand there and do nothing. The man took another step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his tone ominous. "This isn't just about you or him. You're in something much bigger than you could imagine." Grace felt the weight of his words, but she didn't back down. "I don't care," she said, her voice steady. "He's not going anywhere with you." The man smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. He knew she wouldn't give up easily. But what he didn't know was that this time neither would she. The man's eyes narrowed as he took another slow step toward Grace, his fingers curling into tight fists. She could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her, but she refused to flinch. She had never felt this kind of fear before, not like this. The air seemed to crackle with tension, like a storm was about to break, but Grace stood her ground. She wasn't just protecting the boy anymore. She was protecting herself, her home, her peace, everything she held dear. She had crossed a line by offering that boy a meal, and now there was no going back. "You don't understand, do you?" the man muttered, his voice low and guttural, almost like a growl. "You can't help him. You can't save him. He belongs to me." Grace's mind raced. What kind of man was this? Who did he think he was, coming into her diner, threatening her and a child she barely knew? But something in the way he spoke, the way he held himself, told her he was no ordinary person. There was something dark, something far more dangerous at play here. The boy, still sitting in the booth, kept his head lowered, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were turning white. He didn't look up. He didn't speak. Grace could feel the tremble in his body, the fear that radiated off him like a cold mist. He was terrified. Terrified of the man, terrified of what might happen next, terrified of what would happen if he didn't comply. But she couldn't let him go. She couldn't let him be dragged back into whatever nightmare this man had dragged him from. "Get out of here," Grace said, her voice growing stronger, more confident with every word. She reached for the phone again, but this time she didn't just clutch it. She gripped it like a lifeline, a shield. "I'm calling the cops. You're not welcome here." The man chuckled darkly, a sound that made Grace's blood run cold. "You think I'll do anything?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "You think the police can stop me? You have no idea what you're dealing with, lady." Grace's grip tightened on the phone. There was no way she was backing down now. The man's words rattled her, but they also fueled something inside her. The thought of letting this man take the boy away, of giving in to his intimidation, it made her sick. This wasn't just a fight for the boy's safety. This was a fight for everything that was right. She would not let this man win. Not in her diner. Not on her watch. "I don't care who you think you are," Grace said, her voice steady and unyielding. "You're not taking him. Not today. Not ever." The man took another step forward, his eyes locking with hers, full of venom. For a moment, it seemed like he might lunge at her, like he might grab her by the throat and silence her. But something stopped him. He paused, as if considering her words, weighing his options. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and metallic, glinting in the low light of the diner. Grace's heart skipped a beat. Her breath caught in her throat. He was armed. "Are you so sure about that?" he asked, his voice thick with menace. The object in his hand was a small, glinting key. Grace didn't know what it was for, but she didn't trust it. She didn't trust him. Not for a second. The boy, who had been frozen in place, suddenly jerked his head up, his eyes wide with fear. "No," he shouted, his voice hoarse. Don't do it." But it was too late. The man's lips curled into a grin, and before Grace could move, he turned. His gaze no longer focused on her, but on the boy. He stepped toward him, slowly, deliberately, as if savoring every moment. Grace could see the boy's fear escalating. He was trembling, the terror in his eyes now unmistakable. "No, don't take me back," the boy pleaded, his voice rising in desperation. The man stopped in his tracks, his grin widening. "You don't have a choice," he said coldly. "You've been marked. You belong to me." Grace's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the boy, who was shaking with fear, his hands gripping the table, as though it was the only thing keeping him from breaking down. She didn't know who this man was or what he meant by marked, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let him drag this boy back into whatever hell he had come from. She took a deep breath, forcing her fear down, and stepped forward, putting herself between the man and the boy. "No," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "You're not taking him." For a moment, the man just stood there, staring at her. There was something almost curious in his eyes, like he hadn't expected her to fight back, like he had expected her to cower. But Grace wasn't going to cower. Not this time. He looked down at the boy, and then back at Grace, his eyes narrowing. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice almost too calm. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Grace took another step forward, her mind racing. What could she do? What could she possibly do to stop him? She didn't know who he was, but there was something in the way he moved, in the way he spoke, that told her he was not someone to be trifled with. He wasn't a regular man, he was something else. Something far more dangerous. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything the boy had been through. She reached behind her and grabbed the nearest object she could find, a coffee pot. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a weapon, however small, something to defend herself with. She raised it in front of her, her eyes locked on the man, her grip tight. The man's expression didn't change. He wasn't even fazed by her sudden motion. Instead, he simply shrugged, his face darkening with amusement. "Is that really what you're going to do?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think that's going to stop me?" "I don't care what you think," Grace said, her voice low and fierce. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep him safe." The man's eyes flickered, and for a split second, Grace thought she saw a flash of uncertainty in his gaze. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something much colder, much darker. "You're making this harder on yourself," he warned, his voice a deadly whisper. Without warning, he lunged at her. Grace's heart stopped. She swung the coffee pot with everything she had, catching him off guard as it smashed into his side. He staggered back, a surprised grunt escaping his lips. It was a brief victory, but enough for Grace to make her move. She grabbed the boy's hand, pulling him to his feet. "Run," she shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. The boy hesitated for just a moment, looking up at her with wide eyes. But then, without a word, he nodded. He trusted her, and that trust was all she needed. Together, they bolted for the back door. The man recovered quickly, his eyes flashing with fury. "You can't run from me," he shouted, his voice echoing through the diner. Grace reached for the door handle, but the man was faster. In an instant, he was between them and the exit, blocking their path. The boy froze, his face pale with terror. Grace, however, wasn't about to stop. Not now. She yanked open the door, the cold air rushing into the diner, and shoved the boy out into the alleyway behind the diner. "Go," she screamed. "Go." The boy didn't need to be told twice. He took off running down the alley, his footsteps echoing in the night. But as Grace stepped forward to follow him, the man grabbed her arm with a vice-like grip. "You think you can escape?" he growled, his voice full of rage. "You think you can just take him and run?" Grace struggled against his hold, trying to break free, but his grip was too strong. She had no choice. She couldn't let him hurt the boy. She couldn't let him take him back. "Please," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. "Please, just let him go." The man's expression softened for a moment, almost as if he was considering her words. But then, with a cruel twist of his lips, he shook his head. "You have no idea what you're up against," he said, his voice colder than ever. "But you will. Soon enough." And with that, he let go of her arm, pushing her away as he turned to leave, disappearing into the shadows. Grace stood there, her body trembling, her heart still racing, as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Grace stood there, her hand still pressed against the cold metal of the door, her chest rising and falling in frantic breaths. The alleyway ahead seemed darker now, more ominous than it had moments before. She couldn't quite shake the feeling that the man hadn't just left. It was as though he was still there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The boy, her focus, was somewhere down the alley, running as fast as his legs would carry him. She hadn't even seen which direction he had gone, but she trusted that he was running to safety. Or at least, that's what she hoped. Her thoughts were jumbled, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The man had said something about marks, and that the boy belonged to him. Who was he? What was this strange power he seemed to hold over the boy? What was Grace even caught up in? The questions swirled around her mind, growing louder, until she could barely think straight. But there was no time for questions, no time for uncertainty. All she could focus on was the boy, his safety, and keeping him from the danger that man represented. Grace stepped out into the alley, her boots scraping against the gritty concrete. She hesitated for just a second, straining her ears for any sound of movement. The boy was somewhere out there, and she had to find him. But before she could take another step, she heard a faint cry in the distance. It was small, almost like a whisper, but it cut through the night air like a knife. "Grace," the voice called. It was the boy's voice, and it was laced with fear. Her heart clenched. She didn't hesitate. She ran. The alleyway twisted and turned, shadowed and narrow, with only the faint glow of streetlights casting eerie pools of light across the pavement. She could hear the boy's footsteps now, the sound of them growing louder, desperate. She pushed herself harder, her breath ragged in her chest as she sprinted down the path. And then she saw him. He was crouched against the brick wall of an old abandoned building, his face streaked with tears, his clothes ragged and torn. He was clutching something close to his chest, something small, something delicate. Grace's heart broke at the sight. He had been through so much already, and yet here he was, still trying to protect whatever it was that meant so much to him. She skidded to a stop in front of him, her hand reaching out to touch his shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered, trying to calm him, to let him know he was safe. "You're safe now. You're with me." The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide with terror. "He's going to come for me," he said, his voice trembling. "He won't stop until he has me. He won't stop until I'm—" "Shoo." Grace knelt beside him, her hand gently pulling him closer. "You're safe here. He won't get you. I won't let him." But even as the words left her mouth, a sickening chill ran down her spine. She felt it before she saw it, something in the air, something heavy, like the quiet before a storm. The ground beneath them trembled ever so slightly, and she felt a presence, one far more dangerous than anything she had ever felt before. Before Grace could react, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them. A figure appeared at the mouth of the alley, tall and shadowed, a dark silhouette against the fading light of the street. "The man. I told you," he said, his voice like a cold wind sweeping through the night. "You can't hide from me." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. The boy stiffened beside her, but Grace didn't move. She couldn't. Not now. She looked at the boy and gave him a small, reassuring nod. He seemed to calm just slightly, but fear still held him in its grip. The man took another step forward. Grace didn't know what to do. She was out of options. But she knew one thing for certain. This was the end. For better or worse, the boy was right. The man wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. But there was one final choice left. She could either cower in fear and let the boy be taken back to a nightmare, or she could stand and fight, no matter the cost. And in that moment, as the man closed the distance between them, Grace made her choice. She would fight. She would protect the boy, no matter the consequences. And just as the man raised his hand, as though ready to reach for the boy once more, Grace stepped forward and the world went black.